Welcome to Sundays at 2. I'm Maria Del Rosso, and I'm the director of the Fauquier Public Library. We're pleased to have today as our guest Sir Peter Crane, president of Oak Spring Garden Foundation. Sir Peter is internationally known for his work on the diversity of plant life, including its fossil history, evolution, and conservation. He joined Oak Spring after 7 years as the Dean of the Yale University of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And his career has included positions at the Field Museum in Chicago, the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and the University of Chicago. He's joined by our own veteran journalist and editor, Lou Emerson, who's going to lead the conversation with Sir Peter as he has done for us many times in the past for these Sunday conversations. And that's what these Sundays are all about. A chance to get to know the accomplished botanists, artists, authors, educators, the list goes on, who make up and enrich the Fauquier community. There'll be time for questions later in the program, followed by what we hope is more conversation over lemonade and cookies and iced tea. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lou and Sir Peter, and there you go.
Great. Well, thank you, sir, for being here today with us, for sacrificing some of your free time, and congratulations on the most recent honor, the Darwin Wallace Medal from the Linnean Society of London for your contributions to evolutionary science. Ellen and I had the pleasure last year of visiting Oak Springs, and our Oak Springs is just astounding. I would encourage anybody who has the opportunity to go. It's stunning. In March, on the 10th anniversary of Mrs. Mellon's death, you shared on the blog. I never had the privilege of meeting Mrs. Mellon, but her hand and spirit are still very evident here at Oak Spring, through her notes, the memories of those close to her, through her library, and through the beautiful landscape she crafted here during her long life. It is an honor of a lifetime to help steward her legacy. I hope Mrs. Mellon would be pleased by how the Oak Spring Garden Foundation has developed in the decades since her passing, and to see that her legacy of love for art, beauty, and the natural world still remains. Let's suspend reality for just a second. If possible, to have a 1-hour conversation with Mrs. Mellon, what would you ask? What would you want to talk about? And where would that conversation take place?
Oh boy, it would be hard to fit it all into an hour, because I think there are so many areas that we want to explore. I mean, I'd love to know more about the history of the landscape during the 60 plus years that she was crafting it. I'd love to know about the building of the house. I'd love to know about the setting up of the garden. I'd love to know about the motivation for building the library. I'd love to know about what motivated her collecting. I'd love to know how her collecting and Mr. Mellon's collecting interfaced, how they influenced each other. So those are kind of a few of the things that I would want to ask her. I'm glad you read that quote, because that at the end of the day is the ultimate arbiter of whether we're doing a good job or not, is whether she would feel happy. We'll never know, but I hope that she would feel happy with what we're doing at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. It would be a great conversation to have. I mean, we can speak with people who worked for Mrs. Mellon for a long period of time, so we get some glimpse back into the history. But there's much more going back, especially into the 50s and 60s, that would be really interesting to know about. That's not a very exciting answer, but that's
it's a good answer. And where, if possible, would you want to have that conversation?
Oh, I think in the library, for sure. Because, I mean, first of all, it's the most beautiful space. Second, I think it's very much her space. it was a space that Mr. Mellon would go into occasionally, but not very often. It was her space, her private space in a way, her domain. And so that's the logical place to have that conversation, surrounded by all the things that she loved, you know, from the incredible books that she collected to whatever inspired her to buy that Rothko. It would be very interesting to know.
So what attracted you to this? Maria outlined some of the highlights of your career. We could spend hours talking about that, but worked at some of the foremost institutions in the world in terms of plant research and conservation. Why Oak Spring for you at this point in your life and career?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of factors kind of come in. You know, obviously there's one set of factors that involve where you are in your own life and where you are at a particular moment, whether you're ready to make a move or not. And coming up to the end of my second 5-year term at Yale, one question in my mind was, did I have the energy to do a third 5-year term? And the answer to that was no. So it wasn't that I was looking to make a move, but I had heard about the Mellon property many years ago from a close friend who was an early employee of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who knew Mr. Mellon and Mrs. Mellon extremely well. And I remember having lunch with him one day. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was probably 2009 or something like that. And so he described it, and I said to him, Bill, if that ever comes up, you give me a call. And then I wasn't checking the obituaries to see if Mrs. Mellon was still with us, and I forgot completely about it. But I did get an email from him, I think about 4 hours after Mrs. Mellon had passed away. And that then started the conversation, and several of us came down to think about what could potentially happen. And the real attraction, I think, for me was to be able to start, it's not right to say start from scratch, because look at the wonderful assets that we have, but with no clearly defined mission, no clearly defined direction. And Kew was 250 years old, Yale's 300 years old. When you're in leadership positions there, you have to realize that you are just one person in a relay race, and you pick up the baton and then you pass it on to the next person. Here, there was the opportunity to decide which direction to run, and that was an interesting prospect.
The evolution is rather fascinating. I remember the day it was filed, reading the will, and it specified or directed the executors, as I recall, to set aside gift 100 to 300 acres for the foundation, and described substantial but unspecific financial backing and endowment, and a very simple mission. How has it evolved to what it has become 10 years later? It now, I shouldn't say the foundation purchased more than 400 acres across the road, the Rugby property, which I guess wasn't originally contemplated. Can you talk about how this has evolved to where we are today?
I think we've been so fortunate in so many ways. Obviously, we were fortunate in that Mrs. Mellon had the vision that she wanted to her focus was the library, and she mainly wanted to keep the library where it was. I mean, it could have all gone to Princeton or somewhere, but she wanted to keep it where it was. So that was kind of uppermost, I think, in people's minds. So that was the first thing. I think the second thing is she was very fortunate in the lawyer that she had representing her, Alex Forger, who's still alive at the age of 103, and thinking of we're close to the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and remembering that Alex was in the Battle of the Bulge really kind of calibrates this thing for you. He was very wise And he, I think, persuaded Mrs. Mellon not to be prescriptive. And I think we could all come up with examples where very strict conditions have been laid on an estate like this, which constrains its range of movement for the future. He understood what she wanted to have happen, and he made sure that the financial resources were there to make it happen. Alex, who's a New Yorker, calibrated his thinking about landscapes by the size of Central Park. And so he thought that the 100 and whatever it was acres that we started with would be more than enough. And there was early on there was another 100 acres added. And then maybe the boldest move we made was to purchase the Rokeby property back from Mrs. Mellon's estate, which Alex helped us with too enormously. And that's given us the opportunity to do things that just wouldn't have been possible with the original bequest. So I think we were fortunate with Mrs. Mellon's foresight and also with the good advice she received from Alex Forger.
So, how did you start with the land itself? I've heard you describe the property several ways, it being an equestrian operation. I was surprised to learn that there are no redbud or a few redbud on the property.
I mean, the first thing that I wanted to do was to really try to understand a little bit about the history and a little bit about the assets of the landscape. So we asked a guy called Michael Gage, who is an unusual character because he's very much a generalist, and he's just as comfortable in the records office as he is on the landscape. And so he wrote a terrific report for us. He'd worked for me on assessing several thousand acres in northwestern Connecticut, and he'd mainly worked on forests before. But I said, Michael, why don't you come down and do a survey of this? It was then 250 acres or so, and I said it won't be much, it's nearly all horse pasture. It's not much to describe. Well, 200 pages later, we have a fantastic kind of history of this landscape, including, recognizing some of its incredible cultural assets in terms of the Mellon influence and its history prior to the Mellons, but also some of its interesting natural assets. A collection of trees that's pretty wonderful, including some that are centuries old, and some that are only 70 or 80 years old. But getting a handle on that and trying to understand how the land had been managed in the past, how it had come through to us, was really an important thing to do, I think, right at the beginning. And then when we purchased Rokeby, we had to do the same thing on Rokeby. And we'll never be finished with that. For example, I came back last night from a trip, and in my inbox was a report on an archaeological survey that we'd done on part of Rokeby, which raises some interesting questions that we're going to have to figure out how we might pursue in the future. So understanding the history for me has always been important, and that was where I wanted to start with the entire landscape that we have.
And how far along are you with a plan for dealing with all of this property?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first rule should be first do no harm, and so we've been kind of cautious. We planted a lot of trees. I think we've only got about, I think it's less than 15% of the total acreage in woodland. we planted a lot of trees, which might take it to 20% if they all mature. It's still going to be basically grassland. And so then the question is, how do you manage that grassland? And, you know, most of those grasses I'm familiar with because I grew up with them. They're English grasses. They're not native Virginian grasses. And yet, on the other hand, two huge fields that we have of European pasture grasses are superb habitat for bobolinks and you know, a variety of other endangered meadowland birds. So we're probably not going to do much to them. We've evolved into a practice where we will just mow them once a year. We'll mow them in September, and we'll let those populations continue to come back and build up. We've introduced, working with Clifton, we've introduced as many kestrel boxes as we think the landscape will take, and they're doing extremely well. So I think we've got a pretty good handle on the way that the landscape should be managed in the grand scheme of things, but there's a million details still to figure out. There's a central portion on the Rogeby estate where we have contracted with, I guess, a landscape designer to give us some guidance on how we might plant trees in that space to create an arboretum, not just of native species in that small concentrated space, but interesting exotic species too, just so that we could have the tulip tree from here, and we could also have the tulip tree from China growing alongside each other. So, you know, parts of the estate, our plan is still evolving. All of these things take time, but I think we've got a pretty good handle on it now. The one thing we don't have, I should say, this is where we started our conversation when I walked in half an hour ago, was we don't have a really good native meadow. And we've struggled a little bit because we were reluctant to deploy a large amount of herbicide, and that's made it very slow going. And now we are using some herbicide in some spots because it's just very difficult to do otherwise.
Flying over the property on Google Earth, I couldn't help but pause. Many things to pause upon, but the airstrip. What do you do with that?
I've had all sorts of ideas, but none of them will ever come to fruition, actually. What I mainly do is I love to walk on the airstrip. So I go out there sometimes very early in the morning when it's still dark, and I pace up and down the runway, and it's a good place to think. One thing that what do you do? I mean, it's a mile long and 100 feet wide, and it's tarmac. We're not going to tear it up. I think that would be madness. On the other hand, we're not going to maintain it.
And you don't have a Gulf Stream.
Yeah, I don't have the Gulf Stream. And but we've come up with one idea. I don't know whether this group would like it or not, but we're going to have a community festival on Rogeby on the 28th of September. And so we will use it to park the cars for our community festival. But we will also use it for a pickleball competition. So we are going to paint, there are already 2 pickleball courts painted on the runway, but we have room for about 5,000 more pickleball courts. I don't think the competition will be that big, but I hope we have a nice pickleball contest on the runway on the 20th of September.
I've learned something. I don't want to beat it to death, but do you have to maintain the runway, keep vegetation from growing in it, or anything like that?
I mean, I suppose there will come a day when some decisions have to be made. I mean, nothing lasts forever, and but we don't have woody plants seeding into the runway. You do get seeps of water through it for sure, and you've got the odd grasses and sedges coming through, but nothing that's going to be seriously disruptive. Along the margins of the runway, it's very interesting to watch the woody vegetation coming in, and to see what's coming in and what's not coming in. So, I look at the mulberries that are coming in, and they're all about this tall and sort of chewed to a nice little ball, and they're obviously really attractive to the deer. But then things that are less attractive to the deer, surprisingly, are things like persimmon, which is coming up very naturally and is easily dispersed. And for whatever reason, deer love mulberry but hate persimmon. And persimmon gets nicely distributed in the scat of the animals that are eating those fruits. So it's really interesting to watch that process, and we have to manage that process to some degree too. So if we see an ailanthus, we'll have it out. But when we're native vegetation.
You said that the Rokeby side would allow you to do things not originally contemplated. Rokeby is on the west side of the road, Oak Spring on the east side. Altogether 700 acres, 440 on the Rokeby side, which means 260 maybe on the Oak Spring side. Is that close?
Yeah.
So what is the vision for the Rokeby side? What's the mission for the Rokeby side?
Well, what we mainly gained with the Rokeby purchase was all of the houses that have been used by former Mellon employees. And they've now all been renovated. And so what they allow us to do is to bring in artists, scientists, conservationists, ecologists for several weeks at a time. And we put 2 people in each of those houses, so we can have a cohort of almost a dozen at any particular time. And they can more or less look after themselves. They've got a kitchen, they've all got ensuite bathrooms, they're sort of well set up, and they can get on with their work. Some of which will include coming over to look at things in the library, some of which might include work in the garden or on the broader landscape. That would not have been possible with the original acquisition, because even though we very early restored the broodmare barn so that we could have people that could stay overnight, so they come for a course perhaps, that starts on a Monday and ends on a Friday. While they're on site there, we've got to look after them completely. We have to feed them for every meal because they have no self-catering facilities of their own. Whereas Rokeby gave us the opportunity to have people come in for longer periods of time and to be much more self-sustaining. And that's a real advantage. So instead of just getting a little taste of the Mellon property, they can come for a good chunk of time and really get to know us, get to know the place, and really get on with their work.
And food production will take place on the Rokeby side?
Yeah, we have, when we started, we made the decision that we wanted to be all about plants, gardens, and landscapes. That was our focus. And so part of that is obviously food production. And so over on the Rokeby side, relatively small acreage compared to the 400 odd acres over there, but we do produce a lot of mainly vegetables, some fruits over there. Last year we produced 40,000 pounds of fresh fruits and vegetables on relatively few acres. 30,000 pounds of that went to the local food banks, including the one here in Warrington. And 10,000 pounds went to a little local community-supported agriculture program that we have, but also to feed some of those residents when they're on site. So we're very happy with the way, we have a name for it, the Biocultural Conservation Farm is what we call it. The chairman of the board said, "What's biocultural?" Well, I think it's important to remember that the plants that we're growing all have a kind of cultural context. They all come from somewhere, they've all been grown by people over a long period of time. So we want to bring out those stories as well as being a kind of production farm. And we use the farm for not only growing vegetables, but we also grow the plants that people will use when they want to make dyes out of plants. We grow the plants that people would use when they want to make paper out of plants, and so on. So we use it as our kind of educational facility. And then the third area that we've been expanding on Rugby is our local education and outreach. And some of that's work's taking place here in Warrington. We recruited a teacher from Winchester who now runs that program, and she's doing all of our local education and outreach programs in Marshall, in Warrington, elsewhere, and that's an area that we want to see grow. We're just kind of getting started. We're trying to get our facilities in place to do that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an area that we really want to grow. So this summer we'll host 3 one-week-long summer camps, and in all 3 of those summer camps, half of those places will be reserved for people who otherwise couldn't be able to afford those summer camps. So that local outreach is an area that we really want to grow.
And you're involved with some local organizations. You mentioned Clifton. I also read or heard that you want to document the lives of the enslaved people who lived on the property. I believe you're advertising for a research assistant.
Yeah, we've been working on this for a while, actually, kind of a low-key way. We are interested in the history of the property. So we're not only interested in the people who own the land, but also the people who work the land. And delving back, as part of Michael's project to understand the history of the landscape, then we realized that this was a slave-dominated agricultural landscape before the Civil War, a very productive one. And if you look, one of the things that Michael pointed out in his work on the Rugby property, if you look at the agricultural census from 1860 and compare it with the agricultural census from 1870, you can see in pretty stark terms what a difference the social upheaval made at that time. Of course, there were other things going on at the same time, opening up the Midwest and agriculture and so on. But nevertheless, obviously, there was a key moment with a complete change in the agricultural landscape. So understanding more about the history of the enslaved people on the former Mellon properties is something that very gently we're trying to, we're working with the Afro-American Historical Association in the Plains on this. We've employed some VCU students to do some work at the Virginia Historical Society, whatever it's called these days, I can't remember, but so we're gradually doing that. But it's kind of a long-term project, and we're not going to get immediate results. But one of the reasons that we undertook this archaeological survey was to see if we could find any traces of previous occupations on the landscape that are not documented in the buildings that we have right now. We do have a couple of pre-Civil War buildings on the Rokeby side, and we have at least one on the Little Oak Spring side, but those are the only remains of the kind of pre-Civil War landscape that we have. Interestingly, that ties in also to the natural landscape, because what Michael found in his survey of the properties was that the wooded parts of the property have been pretty constant over the last 150 years. So they've been maintained probably as woodlots, for a very long time. And funnily enough, just in the last month, we've focused on one of those woodlots and started to find some very interesting species in there, one of which is a statewide, very rare sedge that we were not expecting to find there. And so we've got some real conservation interest in some of those old woodlots too. And they were probably there in the pre-Civil War landscape, for sure.
A big part of your mission is to support, encourage leaders who will go forth and spread the word of conservation. How does that work? I think I read or heard that you recently closed applications for a new cohort of, I don't know whether they're fellows, researchers, and you had 1,000 applications.
Yeah, so on the last day of May, whenever that was, yesterday or the day before, we closed applications for our 2025 fellowships and residencies. And so I don't know how many applicants we had this year, but I'm expecting it to be north of 1,000. It was north of 1,000 last year. And we offer 8 fellowships, which have a reasonable stipend associated with them, a $10,000 award associated with them. And then we offer a much larger number, around 50 or so, residencies, which they basically would get a small stipend for transport, but then they're kind of on their own. But we expect to award about 50 or so of those. And we're gradually building up so that we're also inviting back some of our alumni, as it were, from previous cohorts that have turned out to be especially good, and that also helps create a kind of an esprit within these cohorts. So I think that's going pretty well, but it's going to be a big job. It's also a big job to sort through 1,000 applications. And then we narrow it down, and then we send them out to various panels around the country who then give us feedback. We'll be making those decisions this fall.
And what are the obligations of those who receive these?
Not much. They can come and get on with their work. Sometimes they're writers, non-fiction or fiction writers. Sometimes they're visual artists. Sometimes they're little glass blowers working with small. Sometimes they're paper makers. Sometimes they're working with dye plants. Some of them are scholars using the library. Some of them are ecologists, writing up their work or understanding the landscape, understanding the plants on the landscape. So there's a whole variety of things. All right. I mean, it's the group that's mainly tuned in to residencies are artists. Artist residencies, there's tons of artist residencies around the country. So artists are very much in tune with finding residencies. But we want to be a little bit more ambitious than that. We want to have some scientists in the mix. We want to have some conservation biologists in the mix, because the idea is to have people of different disciplines talking to each other. So we're working hard on that side to try and get more scientists, more ecologists into the mix, and to have a good range of artists doing a range of different things. And I think we've had some terrific artists. We have a little exhibit on display in the gallery at Oak Spring of some of the work of the artists that have been in the last several years. I mean, they're unbelievable, some of them. We've got a woman who lives somewhere on the outskirts of DC who works in Silver Point and is doing unbelievable illustrations of birds' nests in Silver Point. Can you imagine the detail that requires? Every little hair, every little grass. Unbelievable. And then at the other end, we have people doing quite avant-garde things, and people working with dyes. And then another artist who amongst other things, does embroidery on leaves, which I can't imagine how you do that. In my experience, leaves are kind of brittle. I don't understand how you do that. But she does this most astonishing embroidery on leaves, and also a kind of mandala-like creation by just taking tiny petals and tiny pieces of leaves and sticking them together into a kind of amazing collage. I mean, just unbelievable. So, yeah, the people who came to the Virginia Historic Art Week, and hopefully the people who come to our own days later this month will get a chance to see some of that art.
During their lifetimes, the Mellons earned a reputation as magnanimous, wonderful employers. Many people work there for decades. I suspect you still have some staff members who've been around. How big is the staff? What does it take to run the foundation and take care of all this property, assets?
Our staff is a little over 60, but a fair chunk of them, almost a third of them, who we have on our books are the security team, because we have 24-hour security. And so then you're down to about 40. So then by the time you've got you have to have some finance and administration, and then you've got a library team, a landscape team, a garden team, the farm team. We're pretty thin on the ground in terms of programmatic expertise. Obviously, we've got a group of people who look after the house. But we're blessed to have some pretty wonderful employees, and the employees that have worked for the Mellons in the past are really important for us, because that's the best way for us to know whether Mrs. Mellon would approve or not of what we're doing. So we're checking in with them quite regularly and always asking them for their opinion on how things are going. I think generally they're very positive, and we're very fortunate to have the group that we have. Unfortunately, some of those people are rather like me, at the wrong end of their careers. And so, recruiting good young people, not only on the programmatic side, but on, for example, the facilities side, is very important for us. So succession is actually a big issue for us, and one that we're thinking about, worrying about quite a lot.
I want to get to audience questions here pretty soon, just a couple more from me. Anything on the horizon that will be new that we should talk about right now?
Well, the Community Festival is a sort of new initiative for us, and unlike opening a Little Oak Spring through Virginia Historic Garden Week and so on, where the price point is relatively high, we're going to do absolutely the opposite with the Community Festival. And so we hope that people will come and enjoy it. They'll come and see rugby, they'll park on the runway, they will go up and they'll be able to see the farm, and they'll be able to see the quadrangle, and there'll be a host of sort of plant-related activities for people to enjoy there. So I hope that will be well received, and I hope we get a nice day. It's only one day. I hope the pickleball goes well. I'm hoping that will become a regular feature on our annual calendar. So that's kind of important. I think, sort of behind the scenes, I hope we can make some progress with understanding more about the enslaved people on the landscape. I hope we can make some progress with our arboretum this year. And we're always thinking about what other opportunities we can do within the constraints of our budget and capacity for. We've been thinking too about when we bring a speaker in, maybe we should work them a little harder and have them speak not only out here in Middleburg or Warrenton, but also have them do something in Richmond, maybe do something in Washington. I think one of the things that we're keen to do is to kind of make people aware of us more regionally, and so that people are aware of our programs and they kind of know the courses and so on that we've got going, and so that we're kind of top of mind for people who are interested in plants and gardens and landscapes.
Given the opportunity to ask you about these things, given your status, could you talk a little bit about climate change, invasive species? We could go on for hours, but sort of top of mind concerns and observations about where we are with our planet.
Yeah, I think I'm a kind of a middle of the road kind of a guy. We have to control our invasive species if we want to preserve some of the natural vegetation. But you can't be crazily zealous about this. I mean, they're out. I mean, I've got 700 acres, and it's mainly non-native species. So you have to pick your spots, I think, for dealing with non-native species. And on the climate change thing, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the temperatures are increasing, and people that have lived around here for a long time will know that they don't get as much snow as they used to get, and so on. What I see, maybe I'm more sort of day-to-day about this, is what I see is these kind of traumatic climatic events. And I'm noticing that more than the increasing temperature. I'm noticing a huge storm coming through that, you know, takes the like of which we've obviously not had for 100 years, because those trees that have come down were big trees. The year before I came, we had that giant hailstorm. So it's these kind of massive climatic events that I think are some of the most troubling things. And you know, we're supposed to have a rip-roaring hurricane season this year. That gives me some concern. And then, even in my 8 years here at the foundation, we have wet years and we have dry years, and sometimes that wet comes all at once, and that's a worry. You know, for plants, the distribution of water is almost as important as the temperature itself. You know, they can handle some of this temperature, but if they haven't got any water, they're in trouble. And you know, so a very dry season is a problem. And then when you've got those dry seasons, then you've got the chance of forest fires, and we had some over on the Blue Ridge this year. It's not just a problem of western forests. This is a problem that's coming our way. So those things are things that give me pause.
I believe we have a microphone, and we'll let the audience ask some questions for a bit.
First of all, I should say thank you for spending part of your Sunday afternoon inside when it's nice to be outside. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Come on, gardeners.
I had a question about mowing once a year in your meadows. I wondered why you picked September as opposed to, say, February or whatever.
So it's mainly to let the birds finish their reproductive cycles. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we probably could mow as early as, you know, maybe early August, but leaving it a little longer enables the things that are going to set some seed to get a little bit further through their plant reproductive cycle. In general, the kind of native vegetation is peaking much later than the non-native vegetation. So it's mainly for the birds, is the mowing regime story.
I was wondering about the long-term impact about, you said that most of your plants are not native species. I'm a hiker. I've been hiking these forests for many, many decades and watched them go through evolutions. We lost our chestnuts, we lost our hemlocks, we've lost, you know, entire species. And how, over the long term, what do you anticipate? I mean, like 100 years. How do you anticipate that impacting our environment? You had mentioned another kind of persimmon that I've never heard of. I love persimmon trees. Is there potential for cross-pollination and eliminating and making ours go away?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say exactly how things are going to change, but I think the one thing we can be sure of is that things were changing already before we started to notice the change. And I mean, for example, with the demise of the chestnut, the ecological implications of that must have been profound. You know, all of that fruit, supporting all of that wildlife must have been devastating. And similarly, the sort of changes in the population abundance of deer have had a major impact. Then you've got all of the invasive species problems, and really the invasive species problems are, I mean, they've been going on for a while, but they've really taken off in the last 5 or 6 decades. And if you look at the historical records, many of those plants scarcely had a foothold in the area 50 or 60 years ago. Now they're everywhere. So I think to some extent one's going to have to get used to them. You can't fight them everywhere, but I think you can pick your spots about where you're going to fight them so that you try to keep as much of the native vegetation as coherent as possible, but recognizing that change is just a kind of a normal thing in the environment. But change is happening rapidly, and it's happening as species drop out, and it's happening also with new species coming in. I mean, the ash decline is an interesting one for me. I mean, we've got a lot of dead ash trees on the property, but we've also got a lot of ash seedlings coming up all over. Now, what's going to happen to those ash seedlings? I don't know. But maybe some of them will regenerate, and maybe by the time they regenerate, the problem that affected those ash will have lessened somewhat. So maybe there's a chance that some of those things will come through. So, I mean, I don't think there are any easy answers, but I think we just have to get used to the fact that things are going to change, and we have to do our best to kind of look after those habitats that are still in good shape, and try to restore some habitats that were in bad shape and try to get them into better condition if we can. But it's a long and slow process. I mean, ecological restoration at the end of the day is gardening, and it just depends on how much effort you want to put in to transforming this system into a different kind of system. But at the end of the day, it's gardening, and it requires a lot of effort.
Are there volunteer opportunities at the foundation?
Yes, I mean, particularly on the farm, because we feel that that's an area where volunteers can be really helpful. And so the farm team has got a little volunteer program going now, and if you're interested, check out our website or write to me directly, and we'll get you contacted with the people who are running the farm.
So one was to say thank you very much. Yesterday, I don't know if you went through the farmers market here, but the Oak Springs team came over for kid activities with the master gardeners, and they were pressing flowers and dyeing things, and it was crazy. It was wonderful. So thanks to Ginger and all the people that did that. I love the fact that in our own backyard, we have this global asset in the collection that Mrs. Mellon has in the library, and a lot of the research and things there. And I wonder if you might want to speak about some of the things that you're taking on the road, whether it be art or science or other things. I think it's really cool that you're creating this spotlight for those of us that live in Fauquier County.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I mean, a real issue is, how do we share the resources that we have? How do we share this wonderful collection in the library? There are various ways that we can do that, and we've experimented with various ways of doing it. The most obvious way, in some ways the most expensive and difficult way, is to loan material for exhibits elsewhere. So we have a major part of an exhibit that was at the Gibbs Museum in Charleston through the spring, and that will go on to Wellesley College, Palm Beach, and then Chicago over the next 18 months. And that collection, that's an exhibit on a botanical artist called Rory McEwen. Mrs. Mellon had a few McEwens, but we're putting that botanical art from the 50s and 60s against botanical art from the 18th and 17th centuries to show, you know, they were both painting tulips. How do they compare? So that's one way that we're doing it. The other way is to digitize our most precious assets. We're making good progress with that. And you'll be seeing more and more of that on the website, where you can literally page through a volume that's 300 years old. And of course, we are running classes that use the collection in the library. So we have a class in July with the Red Book School from UVA, where a group of people will come in Monday to Friday. I'll give them some lectures. There'll be some lectures from a specialist around 600 years of botanical illustration. So those are kind of some of the ways that we're using the collection, but we're looking for even more creative ways if we can kind of figure out how we might use the collection. I mean, I think one of the things that's on our mind is the 250th anniversary coming up in 2026. Turns out that we have, so how should we contribute to that celebration? It turns out that we do have quite a lot of the books that Jefferson had in his library, we have in our library too. I mean, not his personal copies, but copies that he owned. So there's something there. Should we do something at the Philadelphia Flower Show? That's another question. So those kinds of things we're thinking about. But we're looking for more creative ways. So I'll give you one example. I don't think it's necessarily the best example of how to share the collection, but I think it offers an opportunity. So last year was the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted, America's greatest landscape architect, who worked, for example, on the Capitol grounds, on the layout of the paths at Yosemite, and had an impact across the entire country. So we worked with the Olmsted 200 people to put together a very nicely curated exhibit of 23 panels that discussed Olmsted's work and the importance of Olmsted's work, illustrated the importance of Olmsted's work. And we made that available on our website. So, okay, there's nothing very creative about that. It's just an electronic website. But the innovation, I think, was that we provided the opportunity to download each of those panels in high resolution. So, working with the Olmsted 200 people, that exhibit was downloaded several hundred times by people across the country who had Olmsted landscapes and who wanted to celebrate their Olmsted landscapes. So it was an electronic exhibit that could be turned into a physical exhibit. So you could just download those files, take them to Kinko's, and you could have them printed this size, or you could have them printed this size, depending on what your facility was. So that's an area that we like, because the reach was fantastic for a little organization like us. But it only works if you've got a really good partner. And finding the right partners to do that, and whether that's Garden Club of America or some other organizations that can help push out those exhibits, because build it and they will come is probably not the right approach for us.
Just didn't notice them. Do you have ginkgos at Oak Spring, and would you tell us about how it came to be that you wrote a whole book about ginkgos, and tell us a little bit about those trees?
Yeah, I mean, they're not very prominent at Oak Spring. There are actually two ginkgos in what was obviously at one point a tree nursery that the Mellons created. So they're fairly mature, they're tucked away. And then we planted a couple of ginkgos on Rokeby. But it's hard to compete with the however many hundred ginkgos they have at Blandy. I mean, my interest in ginkgo was a personal challenge in a way to myself. It was to see, having written however many scientific papers and several scientific books, could I write a popular book? And I decided that I could, but maybe only once in my lifetime. And so the question was, what should I write it on? And I chose ginkgo because it was quite a tactical decision. It was because it had all of the pieces that I wanted to talk about in the book. It had a deep fossil history, which I know something about. It has some really interesting biology that relate to that fossil history. It also has a fascinating cultural history, both in Eastern Asia, where it's from, and how it was brought into cultivation, but also then how it was noticed in the West and then spread around all over the world. And then its kind of cultural importance today in terms of its importance as a street tree, a horticultural tree, as a nut tree in the East, and as a medicinal plant. It had, and a great conservation story, by the way, because this is a tree that was very restricted in its distribution, and is probably one of those trees that's flourished mainly because of its association with people. Might well have gone extinct. It used to be all over the globe 50 million years ago, but it was reduced down to some small populations in China until it fell under the control of people who wanted to grow it for its nut production. And then people figured out when they had the Great Kanto earthquake in Tokyo, and the place was set on fire, the ginkgos survived preferentially. Similarly at Hiroshima, there's these famous ginkgos that survived the dropping of the first atomic bomb. So anyway, there were no shortage of stories around ginkgo to talk about, and an opportunity to talk about many different things: history, biology, culture, conservation, and so on.
The people are silent.
Thank you. It's always astonishing to me the resources that we have in this community, and we appreciate your generous time in sharing it with us, and look forward for many years to come on the great success of the Oak Springs Garden Foundation. I just wanted to announce that you have this at your place, but our next conversation will be with Karen Hughes-White, who is the director of the Afro-American Historical Association here in Fauquier. Peter mentioned their connection with her and looking at the enslaved population at Oak Springs. They have done remarkable work here in Fauquier County, and Karen is a dynamic speaker, and we're looking forward to that conversation on September 15th here in the John Barton Payne Building. We also have, and Ken Garrett is actually here in the audience today, but something somewhat unique to our program of conversations. On November 24th, Ken, as many of you may know, has been a National Geographic photographer for many, many years, and with a brilliant career, including countless books, articles, and cover stories for National Geographic, particularly focused for the last 40 years on work in Egypt. And so, because the images of Ken's work is so vital to kind of his message, we need a room in which we can actually show audiovisuals. And so Highland School has agreed to partner with the library, and we will be doing the November program with Ken at Highland School, focused on his work in Egypt and his more than, I don't know, how many cover stories and books on Egypt? There's a great many anyway, and
So I have 14 covers on the domestic edition. I have 13 stories on Egypt and 7 books on Egypt. But I have more than 60 published stories in the magazine.
right. So lots for Ken to share with us November 24th, but in a room that will be accommodating to the audio visuals, which we have not been able to do here in the John Barton Payne building, because first, there's no way to control the light. Second, we don't have any built-in facilities. And so this is, and you may have noticed a little sign over there celebrating 100 years. John Barton Payne, this building was constructed in 1924. So this is the 100th anniversary of this particular structure, which I think is really kind of an iconic structure for downtown Warrenton. We feel that it could use some updating after 100 years, and particularly with a focus on audiovisual presentations, which would make this room so much more useful to the community to have built-in audiovisuals, better speakers. The acoustics in here are not of the best quality for sure. We have a proposal to provide audiovisual that would be new screen and projection system coming down from the ceiling, some help with the acoustics and what have you. It's a $50,000 proposition. We have the prospects of a $25,000 kind of matching grant, and so the Friends of the Library have decided to engage in a fundraising campaign to match that additional $25,000. And this is the first public mention of this that we're doing today. And so this is brand new. We've just gotten this proposal, but we want you to know that we will be sort of going out into the community to look for that additional $25,000 to help bring this building up to a more useful presentation space for the community. So anybody interested in helping with that, just call me, and we'd be very happy to have a conversation with you. But thanks again to Sir Peter and to Lou. Round of applause for